Now, engines can be a thing of preference, but with BMW and their fair share of issues, the B58 has become the greatest engine they've ever made. I'm Alex Nelson, and today we're going to tell you everything you need to know about the BMW B58. It's so good. The B58 is an all-aluminum 3-liter direct-injected straight 6, and it's been in every BMW 40i car since 2016, except for that weird 640i that had an N55 that one time. It's even been in cars that don't have a BMW badge on it because other manufacturers love it so much. Now, we all know that the B58 can make a ton of power, and as I said, people call it the new 2JZ, but none of that is by accident. And I want to talk about why the B58 is what it is, and how it may have single-handedly changed BMW's brand perception. In my hands are two different service histories for two very similar X5s. They're both 2019, they're both G05 X5s with 75,000 miles. Now, in my right hand is an N63 car with the 50i trim. Makes a little bit more horsepower. This is the venerable B58 40i trim, and as you can see, it's 7 pages of wonderful oil changes, brake flushes, cabin air replacements, and spark plug changes. The 50i car is 46 pages of service history. And no, we didn't just pick a lemon. Looking across hundreds of VINs, we discovered that over a quarter of all N63 cars are actually going to need their timing cover removed and that gasket replaced, along with the crank seal for about 10% of cars. And 10% doesn't sound like a huge number, but it's a lot of ownership experiences. This isn't a Rolls-Royce, this is a mass-produced engine for a global market. You can see why BMW had to develop a core engine, the B58, for their SUVs and their performance variants. The engine is basically perfect for performance applications, given that it was based on the diesel counterpart and it's designed for these heavier duty applications. It's no wonder that an M340i with some basic mods is as fast as an outgoing F80 M3. You see, BMW wasn't playing around when they decided to make the B58. They had to increase their reliability and especially the engine's capability in much heavier and bigger cars like modern SUVs. And yes, all of this came about well before the 2020 Supra and its collaboration with Toyota. Oh, and before you mention me comparing the B58 to an N63 instead of a B58 to its predecessor, the N55, let's just remember how putting an N55 in an SUV went 15 years ago. Yeah, they needed to start from scratch. It's no wonder that they're starting to badge B58 equipped cars like the new X3 and M50. It is the replacement for BMW's highest output cars. Well, ones without a proper M badge. Now, the B58 comes from BMW's modular engine platform, or the B series engine platform, which BMW literally relates to Lego blocks in their own literature, which is absolutely fantastic. This platform has given us the stout B38 in Mini Coopers and in the original i12 i8, as well as the B48, which people have pushed to the moon and back, and of course the legendary B58. And in fact, some of the technologies that are on the B series engines have actually trickled backwards into the N63 TU3 and the S68 power plants in larger cars and the twin-turbo V8 stuff. If this just sounds like alphabet soup, there is a method to the madness, and the naming scheme and the number schemes relate to engine displacement and the engine type. Before we dive into everything that makes this engine hopefully not tick, let's take a look under the hood of a car with the B58. Now, under the hood of a B58 equipped car like our X3 M40i, you'll see a lot of stuff that's much more similar to what you'd find on a prior BMW M car or a BMW twin-turbo V8 than you would on something like an N55. So first things first, your intake is on the left. That's fairly standard, and some cars will have this little box positioned here. Now, that's actually the intake silencer. And it basically cancels out resonance from all the wonderful sounds coming from your turbo. Coming over from that, we have the engine cover. Now, this is easily removable. I'm just pulling up on it. And then it exposes the wonderful, probably very dusty B58. Do check for rodents hanging out under here periodically. I had a G12 7 Series that had a lot of mice underneath the engine cover because they love that sweet, tasty soy-based foam or whatever they're putting under there these days. And the engine itself is very messy to look at, but I promise there is a method to the madness. On the left here, you have your typical valve cover, and this is a Gen 2, so there is no visible PCV system. We'll get into that later. You, of course, have your direct injection system with your mechanical fuel pump over here. You can install that backwards. Ask me how I know. You have your coil packs, which is fairly standard, and make sure that these locks aren't broken. You'll also notice that there is a lack of intake piping in this engine bay compared to something like an N20 or an N55, and that is because BMW has thankfully integrated the intercooler directly into the intake manifold. It's a very cool design. So the intake pipe goes straight out of the turbo and directly into the motor. The entire intake tract is probably about 36 inches long, which is absolutely fantastic. Unfortunately, all of this makes for a ton of plumbing on the right-hand side of the engine bay, and if you want to access things like the oil filter housing or the heat management module, which we'll also talk about later in this video, you're going to have to pull off this intake manifold. On the right, this will be similar to BMW M cars of old or V8 twin turbo cars. There are two cooling circuits. There is a high temp with the VW style magic ball, and then on the left of that will be the low temp circuit, which cools things like the turbocharger, and that will have its own intercooler in front of the radiator as well. And if you hear things like a screaming or whining noise, just be sure that it's very unlikely to be a pulley or some sort of belt system squeal. It's very likely to be a PCV issue. So if you pop your hood and there's any sort of crazy noises coming from this area where you see oil pooling around the oil cap, it's likely a PCV issue. Again, we'll get into that later in the video. You'll also find this little valve here, which has a whole bunch of hard plastic tubes going to that. That is your fuel tank vent valve. So when you mention that later in the video, and I mention how easy it is to install, that's why it's right here on top of the intercooler. So with a look under the surface of a 40i equipped car, let's take a deeper dive and talk about the technologies that allowed the B58 to do what it does. Now you might think that this platform sharing would just cheapen the engine and it's not really for any performance gains, but there was the perfect storm with the B58. Its fundamental block, crankshaft, connecting rods, and many other components within the engine are fundamentally shared with the B57 diesel engine, which is why the B58 has so many upgrades for strength and performance. The biggest one being a closed deck block design, which was previously only reserved for BMW diesels, and one of the shortfalls of the N55 with its open deck head and exposed cylinder sleeves. The B58 also has an extremely thin steel arc wire sprayed lining on the aluminum cylinder bores and coated piston skirts to allow it to rev to 7,000 RPM, much unlike its diesel counterpart. This shared platform with the diesel and all of that extra torque is why, even though the B58 on paper is only a marginal horsepower increase over the previous generation N55, when you drive the cars back to back, you will immediately notice a huge difference in acceleration, and it's a lot snappier and a lot more responsive than something like an X5 35i or a 335i. And something else shared with its diesel counterparts, an integrated crank sprocket that cannot spin freely from the crankshaft. I'm looking at you, S55. Now this connection to its diesel relative is a great starting point, but there's a lot of stuff that BMW changed to address specific issues that the previous generation engines had. One of those, as I'm sure you've probably heard of, is the IROX coated bearing. Now we touched on this in our B48 video, and it all stems from start-stop. BMW openly states that pulling away from a stoplight in an N55 or N20 equipped vehicle causes solid body contact, which is literally metal on metal because the oil pump isn't able to generate oil pressure soon enough under load. Now, what do you do to solve this if you're BMW and you're under the gun of emissions regulations? Well, you develop a bearing that can handle it. IROX coating is a resin matrix with a distinct red color that's applied to the upper rod bearing shells and the main bearing shells. This coating is extremely durable, and it's what allowed the B58 to last much longer under warranty than its N20 or N55 cousins with stop-start enabled in regular driving. Now, speaking of bearings and journals, I want to touch on a fundamental difference between the B58 or general B series of engines and the N series of engines. Now, when the E70 first came out with the N55, the 35i variants, they were having rod bearing failures left and right. And if you've ever pulled apart an N20 or an N55 and seen just how slim those connecting rods are along with their journals, it's kind of easy to see why. For the B series engines, they majorly widened the journals, and as I mentioned, they have that IROX coating. They also have a fracture split connecting rod, which is why you can't see a seam whatsoever on this connecting rod. They basically drop forge it, which if you've never seen drop forging, it's a pretty crazy process. They have a massive press, which smacks a glowing hot piece of metal into shape, causing all of this metal structure to be in the correct orientation for taking the loads. The N55 just had cast iron rods. This process, along with machining it and fracturing it, allows for a perfect fitment, but it does mean that if you ever rebuild one of these, you will need to have specific connecting rod caps to your connecting rod. They cannot be mismatched. Speaking of cool connecting rod technology, something that's also new for the B58 engine is a trapezoidal small end of the connecting rod. Now, BMW discovered that with a square small end journal, when the piston rocks slightly side to side, it actually binds on the small end bearing. Now, with a trapezoidal design, it's able to float a little bit more and translate more cylinder force directly into the big end of the rod, which is super helpful for longevity and a direct move towards a more reliable performance engine. Now, if you thought that forging a connecting rod already looked cool, imagine doing that for an entire crankshaft. That's right, compared to the N55's cast iron crankshaft, the entire crankshaft in the B58 and its diesel counterpart are drop forged, which is super sick for making big power, and it's why they can handle so much low-end torque. And to control all of these forces, there is a change that I think initially had people a little bit frustrated, but it's for good reason. The timing chain has been moved from the front of the motor, you might remember seeing our N20 timing chain video, to the back of the motor in between the transmission and the engine, which of course means if you want to replace or service the chain or the tensioners, you will have to lower everything and split the engine and the gearbox. There's a good reason for it though. BMW realized that there can be additional wear when the forces from shifting have to translate all the way through the crankshaft, back up through the timing chain, and then along all of the valve train. What they've done instead is by positioning that chain in between the crankshaft and the transmission, when you shift or there's an aggressive upshift right at red line, those forces are translated just into the crankshaft hub, into the timing sprocket, and then up to the timing gear, which takes a ton of stress off of the crankshaft and also makes sure that you have a more accurate timing sync. Now back to improvements over the N55. BMW spent a ton of time on the N-Series engines figuring out how to make Valvetronic work. Now, Valvetronic is a system that allows you to have a throttle blade completely open all the time, and everything you're doing with the gas pedal is actually just adjusting valve timing. So there's an actuator motor which sits on an eccentric shaft, which adjusts the valve position relative to what the camshaft is asking for. Now, this system is pretty brilliant, but it actually caused quite a few issues on the N-Series of engines. One of the most major issues was that the oil squirter for this worm gear, which was mounted high up above the rest of the engine, would get clogged and it would run dry with oil. This would of course cause this worm gear, which has to act every single time you touch the throttle, to dry up, and it would send shards of metal all over your engine, destroying the entire motor. Really sucked. For the B58, they eliminated this oil squirter and positioned the Valvetronic actuator lower down in the head and bathed by a bunch of oil that comes out of one of the camshaft journals. It's a much smarter design, it won't get easily clogged up, and they made this attached to the side of the head instead of in the valve cover, so it's a little bit easier to remove the valve cover and cleans things up slightly. Now, the Valvetronic updates didn't just stop there. Both Vanos and Valvetronic work together in this engine to provide way more adjustment range than it's ever had on any engine previously. They did this for some absolutely brilliant reasons. They figured out that by advancing the Vanos and Valvetronic and slightly closing the throttle body, they're actually able to create a suction in the charge pipe system, which can then be used as an EGR pump to circulate unburnt fuel and oil vapors inside of the engine. Now, what does this mean? Well, for the Gen 2 B58, you no longer have to worry about a PCV valve that will fail and scream at you, or an EGR valve on the exhaust manifold. Now, what does this mean for the seat of your pants? Well, it means the car will have both low-end torque and high-end horsepower. Now, valve overlap is what you want for high-end, high RPM performance. It's what creates that wonderful chop sound that you hear from American muscle cars like a C6 Corvette. Now, while overlap creates a pretty awesome sounding idle, it's actually not favorable for low-end torque. So Vanos is able to adjust the valve timing so that both the intake valve and exhaust valve are able to seal properly at idle, giving you a smooth start, nice idle, and lots of low-end grunt. But then it's able to adjust to have more overlap as the RPM increases in order to give you that high-end horsepower. Now, there's been a lot of looking into the future with the B series of engines, but BMW brought a few things back. One of them, and much appreciated, is a mechanical belt-driven water pump. Thank you, BMW, for this. Unlike an N-series electric water pump, which will just die and leave you stranded, all this will do is leave a little bit of a territorial mark in your driveway when it leaks out of the shaft seal, which they like to do at about 80,000 miles. Now, stepping back a little bit is the oil pump with which they integrated the vacuum pump into for the second generation engines. This new oil pump for the 2019 and 2020 model B58s caused some absolutely crazy issues, and we're going to dissect this and get more into that. So on the outside, this pump looks like pretty much every other pump, and they did replace this after 2020 production with a metal version on the inside, that is. If you're not familiar with a variable displacement oil pump, modern cars, instead of using a traditional oil pump with just these little lobes in them, basically the entire outer carrier of the oil pump will move back and forth, which changes the maximum displacement of the plungers in the oil pump. It basically can change how much volume or how much pressure the plunger can move at any given time. This is usually controlled by a solenoid. You might have heard of N-series engines having a solenoid you could unplug for max oil pressure, and that's what that's referring to. Now, in this oil pump, what gives it the plastic oil pump name is that carrier, which moves back and forth and pivots to adjust the volume flow, that is made entirely of plastic. So what generally happens is someone will totally fairly assume that it should take thicker oil than it does from the factory. They'll put like 540 in it, and that will mean that this carrier is under an enormous amount of stress compared to what it was designed for. Now, if you look closely, you'll see there's a spring here. There's actually two springs. One is beneath the other. These springs are constantly forcing this carrier back into its maximum oil flow position. And the way this works is that there's an oil inlet which travels through this little pocket right here. And when the solenoid allows flow, that oil will populate inside of this pocket here and will actually fill this volume, moving the entire assembly over to the right. So as you can see with this cover off, this is the oil pump itself. And as I spin this, you'll see the impeller and the plungers, which are moving the oil. Those are what are actually pumping your oil. Now, if I move this carrier over, which is what the solenoid would do if it was requesting greater fuel efficiency, you can see that those plungers don't go as far. If I push it back in, that's your maximum oil flow, maximum oil pressure. But you can see that if this pocket here was filled with a whole bunch of 5-weight 40 on a cold January day, and suddenly this pocket has to go like that, that's putting a whole lot of stress on this plastic carrier right here. And that is why it fails. Now, if you use the BMW recommended oil, which is 0820, you are going to be just fine and it isn't going to break. But if you choose to put thicker oil in it, or maybe you're doing like a track day and putting more load on this, you're going to have that plastic piece failing. So this is the B58's integrated vacuum pump in the oil pump. If I spin this gear, it's pretty mesmerizing to watch it work. It has these two little apex seals, and this piece is also plastic, but a bit less of a concern, as I'm assuming it's probably plastic for ultra low friction, and it has these little fancy apex seals, and that is how your B58 generates vacuum. Now, unfortunately, the throwback vibes pretty much end there, and BMW went off to the races overcomplicating things that probably didn't need to be overcomplicated. So let's talk about the thermostat, or the HMM, or the heat management module. So this is the new thermostat. This is a B58 heat management module, and it does away with a conventional thermostat. If you're not familiar with what conventional thermostats or a map controlled thermostat and this have in common, well, I'll show you. Now this right here in my right hand is a traditional thermostat. In fact, this one's for the beloved M52 from an E36. This is as simple as it gets. It's a wax-filled volume up top in the brass here, which then heats up, expands, and pushes down on a spring, moving this little valve, which then allows coolant to bypass or not bypass depending on whether the engine is heated up or not. Now, a little while after these were used in BMWs came the map-controlled thermostat. Now, this is fundamentally the exact same underneath as a traditional thermostat. It has the same wax-filled volume, it has the same spring, it even uses the same style of valve. The difference is that it has a plug on it. Now, this plug actually activates a heater, and the heater can artificially heat up this wax element before the coolant is heated up in order to force coolant through the system whenever the DME or the engine electronics decide that it's necessary. Now, these both work great if you want to just control water pump flow for the entire cooling system in the car. If you only have one cooling circuit, that makes it even simpler, and this is basically a warm-up valve. Now, what happens if you have two cooling systems, an intercooler in the manifold, you have a aluminum head with a temperature sensor in it, you have a block with a separate temperature sensor in it, and you want to manage all of those things individually? Well, you do what they did on the B58, and you come up with this monstrosity that is entirely made of, you guessed it, nylon plastic. So as I said, this is the heat management module, and this one in particular is actually the heat management module plus SCV, or split cooling valve. This allows cooling flow partition between the head and the block to be altered in the event that the head is really hot and the block isn't, or they're trying to achieve some sort of efficiency within the head and the leanest, hottest combustion they can get. Basically anything other than, let's say, hot lapping or driving on the Nürburgring or extremely aggressive B-road driving, the coolant flow through the block is very, very minimal. And it's pretty much just using the thermal mass of the block to overcome all of the heat from combustion. The head is really what's being cooled the most. Now, coming off of one of the most complicated parts of the cooling system, we're going to talk about one of the fundamentals. Now, if you've owned BMWs in the past, especially if you have an E36 like me, you're probably very familiar with this blue bottle. This is Xerox G48, and you'll know it as the coolant that we include in many of our cooling system kits. Now, the change for the B48 and the B58 announced in 2018 is this green jug right here. This is called HT12. And aside from just the color, there are numerous chemical changes that came with this new coolant. One of them is a new technology called Frostox, which is a corrosion inhibitor for aluminum components, which, as you might have been able to tell by now, there are a lot of in new engines, and particularly the entire BMW B series lineup. So this is all you're going to want to use in your B58 or B48 if you're replacing things like the water pump, hoses, etc. Now, that's not to be said that this fixes everything. The plastic components in the B58 still have some issues with hydrolysis, which we've seen on our own X3 M40i car with things like this radiator hose from the cylinder head failing right at the hose barb. Now, unfortunately, this is something that can only be prevented by replacing these parts with metal, which is going to require a pretty significant amount of DIY work, but rest assured, we have plenty of these metal conversion components for the B58 and B58 TU here at FCPEuro.com. And rounding out our new technologies that came with the original B58 were new injectors. Thankfully, they stuck with solenoid injectors manufactured by Bosch, unlike the piezo injectors of old. Now, it should be noted that Bosch actually introduced a new tool set for these second generation engines. The original ones, which have a larger tip, will work with the original N55 and N63 injector tools, and the new ones will not. You'll need the new tools. This is all fantastic though, because you no longer have to input a hex value when you replace your injectors for calibration. They simply can be reinstalled just like any old car was in the 90s, and they'll work straight off the bat. There's no programming required, which is very, very, very welcome. Now, it's not all rainbows and butterflies. In 2020, BMW caught on to the tuning scene, and in June of 2020 production, they locked the DMEs. So 06 of 2020 going forward, the DMEs are locked and will require a bench flash in order to be modified and tune the car. There are companies that do that. Don't tell anyone I told you that. Now, everything I just discussed is probably making you think that the B58 is way better than the N55, which it is, and you're probably already thinking about which type of 40i car you want to buy. But now we're going to get into the stuff that is not so pretty. In fact, the first thing we're going to talk about is fundamental design flaws with the B58. So speaking of garbage design, another one is the plastic oil filter housing. You've surely heard of this by now. It is a huge issue that affects every single B58 car on the road. And if you're at 100,000 miles in your B58 equipped car or thinking of buying one, this is a real thing to consider. You'll notice that the gasket surfaces and everything around them is plastic. Now, this wouldn't be a huge deal if it were just the oil filter stand. However, the oil filter housing in these cars also has a heat exchanger mounted to it, which is also passing coolant through it at the hottest part of the engine. Now, unfortunately, this means that over time, the plastic oil filter housing starts to warp, crack, and then starts to leak. And oftentimes when they leak, they will transfer coolant into the oil or oil into the coolant. And you'll notice this as maybe just a couple drops of coolant on the ground, but if it's leaking coolant, it's probably also leaking oil. You can replace this, and we have a complete guide on how to replace the oil filter housing on either a B58 or a B48, and you can also replace it with some metal units which have started to spring up. So we've talked about the oil filter housing itself, but I want to talk about the oil filter that's within it. If you ever see a crushed oil filter like this, or if when you're installing an oil filter onto a B58 equipped car or a B48 equipped car, and you see that it's crushed and all circular like this or twisted like this, it's because there's probably a stuck bottom portion of a previous oil filter stuck in the bottom of the oil filter housing that you just can't see. I experienced this on my own G12 740i, and I was trying to get the filter in. I thought maybe we had cataloged it wrong and it was the wrong length. Turns out on one of the early oil changes on the car, the bottom of this filter had broken off in the oil filter housing. It was covered in oil, so I couldn't see it. I was just trying to get the oil filter down in there. We actually have a tech tip on how to get a pick down inside the oil filter housing, twist it, and remove this. And if you experience this with your oil filter housing, please make sure to remove that remaining oil filter debris from the bottom of the oil filter housing. So now that I've mentioned the oil filter housing and the filter, I do want to talk about replacement. So many of us are familiar with this wonderful brand, MAN Filters. They make some of the best and most consistently available filters for the BMWs that we love. Now, this is an obvious choice if you're someone who's had prior BMWs, but there's a bit of a catch. This oil filter housing is manufactured for BMW by an OE called UFI. Now, when this is installed on BMWs at the assembly plant, it already has an oil filter in it. And you guessed it, that is also manufactured by the company UFI. Now, BMW is replacing your oil filter with another UFI filter when you get your car serviced at the dealership. And as we've seen before, if you choose to install this MAN filter into your car, you actually could void the factory warranty, as it's not a UFI filter that came with the car. So regardless of your favorite oil filter brand, just be aware of that warranty exception and make sure not to screw future you over by putting a non-OEM filter in the car. Now, something that definitely shouldn't change is the quality and type of oil you're putting in your car. We have a whole blog post on which BMW oils are accepted for which cars under which oil grades, but the viscosity is incredibly important with this engine, especially if you have one of those 2019 or 2020 produced cars with the plastic cage oil pump. While the oil viscosity does sound pretty crazy, 0 weight 20, trust me, it's what BMW recommends for good reason. Now, something that is absolutely not new to BMWs is failing expansion tanks. Yep, that's right. They still just laser weld or heat weld two ends together and create a perfect storm for a coolant leak on the expansion tank. I have personally had these fail on my own B58 car at around 70,000 miles. If you see white streaks of coolant starting from this flange and lower and not up on the cap where it's simply bleeding off coolant, just know that your expansion tank is probably about to give out and you're going to want to replace it. It typically doesn't happen with the low temp expansion tank, which is the small one to the left of the main expansion tank, but it does happen on every single car with the main high temperature expansion tank. Now, another fundamental design issue with the B58 actually isn't the mechanical design of the Vanos solenoid itself or the wonderful tool that you can use to unclip it from the valve cover. It's actually to do with software. There's a software glitch with some B58 cars which causes what appears to be a Vanos solenoid code code 21A02D, and you might think it's your Vanos actuators, and you might actually buy this special tool to do the job. Oftentimes, it's just a quick dealership software update which will fix this Vanos solenoid issue. So with a lot of the fundamental and hard to reach things out of the way, let's talk about stuff that's on top of the motor in the engine bay. The first one I want to talk about is something that I bet you many people watching this are already familiar with it. This is the fuel tank vent valve. Now, as I pointed out in the intro, this sits right on top of the valve cover and it's pretty easy to access. If you ever fill up your B58 equipped car, or honestly your B48 or B38 equipped car, and you notice that at hard starts it cranks for a few extra seconds, that's because this thing is probably gummed up and it's not sealing correctly. Now, BMW actually extended a warranty on these to up to 15 years and 150,000 miles on specific models, although I think they've pretty much extended it on specific models until they've covered their entire model range. So if your car is less than 15 years old or less than 150,000 miles, you can probably get this replaced for free at a dealership with the expense of your own time. If you want to purchase it from us, it takes 5 minutes to change. It's extremely easy to replace. So if you have a check engine light and there's no message on the dash and the car seems to run fine except for right after you fill it up, it's probably that, and it takes 5 minutes to replace. Now, something that does not take 5 minutes to replace, but we do have a guide on how to do it, is this valve cover right here. Now, this is a Generation 1 valve cover, and produced up to 2020. You'll notice here it has a PCV valve, which is plastic welded to the valve cover. Now, if you've owned an N55, you probably already know what I'm going to point out. It's that these PCV valves fail. There's a small rubber diaphragm in them, which will crack and allow pressure to go in the wrong spots. And eventually you will have a crazy loud hissing noise as all the pressure in the crankcase tries to make its way out of every single orifice in the engine. Now, for 2020 plus models, BMW fixed this issue with an updated valve cover which doesn't feature a PCV valve at all. Now, BMW in 2020 finally figured out that they could get rid of that valve by simply adjusting the Valvetronic actuation and the throttle valve to create a vacuum in the intake runner and move gases around accordingly. And this leads me to one of my last fundamental design flaws to point out about the B58 Gen 1 and Gen 2, which is this guy. This is the factory charge pipe. Thankfully, unlike an N-Series engine, there is much less charge piping in the engine bay thanks to that wonderful water-to-air intercooler. But this plastic charge pipe has a similar failure mode to the expansion tank where it simply cracks over time, allows boost to escape, or fails entirely. Now, if you're planning on tuning your car or running something like a Dynatronics, you might want to pick one of these up in metal or replace the OEM one because these are pretty well known to fail, especially under high load. All right, finally, let's discuss service intervals. There really wasn't a whole lot of maintenance items to touch on in this video aside from the critical and fundamental things that should happen at higher mileages, but these are generally good intervals to live by. So for oil changes, again, we have that blog on which oil grade you can use. BMW recommends 10,000 miles. Now, this is kind of pushing it, and your engine will slowly varnish up if you use a 10,000 mile interval. Basically, the inside of it will turn orange after 100,000 miles. So we would recommend 3,000 to 5,000 miles. Not just saying this because I work here. I've had my own S65 engine sitting on a stand and my friend and coworker Garrett's engine sitting over here with 55,000 miles on it. And he has done regular oil changes at 3,000 to 5,000 miles and the inside of his engine was spotless. Meanwhile, mine looked like something that was uncovered after a shipwreck. Spark plug services, BMW recommends 60,000 miles. Obviously, if you are running a tuned car or ethanol or something like that, you'll probably want to shorten that interval to something more like 30,000 miles. And I would recommend doing the coil packs every 100,000 miles on a stock car. A lot of times, if you purchase a car at 100,000 miles, many things are probably about to break and they may have been neglected from the previous owner. So make sure you run through and replace things like cooling flanges, cooling hoses, things that are weeping coolant. Make sure you keep an eye out for the white coolant streaks, as we mentioned, to stay on top of any potential coolant leaks. About every 20 or 30,000 miles, you should be looking at changing the engine air filter. Now, that might sound a little bit lower than you're used to, and that's because modern engine air filters actually have a very fine foam layer on top of them, which can easily clog up. This happened on a B58 Mini I recently serviced. this design is a little bit odd to me because the finer foam layer on top is sitting above the paper filter. Now, this foam layer is much less surface area than the stacks of paper and can clog up a lot faster than the paper beneath it, kind of prematurely destroying the filter. But regardless, you're going to want to change that to make sure you're getting peak horsepower and you don't hurt your engine. And finally, be sure to keep some HT12 coolant on hand, as B58s with higher mileage have been known to drink a bit of coolant. Now, it goes without saying that the coolant loss is probably caused by another part that needs to be replaced, such as the water pumps, which like to leak through the input shaft. So keep an eye on that, but good idea to keep this in your trunk regardless. Now, we've already mentioned everything to do with the oil filter housing, the filter, and the oil itself. BMW actually also has a special tool for capturing the oil, which tends to drip out when you take the filter out. Now, this can be avoided by stuffing paper towels down in the engine bay, but this can lead to what BMW calls a thermal event. Your car burns to the ground. They burn to the ground. So maybe that tool's a good idea. Okay, so let's quickly discuss service bulletins. These are issues that BMW is aware of and has posted information of for dealers to learn about. The first one is oil leaking from the turbocharger. Now, on something like an S55 or an N55 equipped car, this was usually because the turbocharger seal to the charge pipe had broken down and was leaking oil from all the PCV gases. In this case, it's actually because the turbo band clamp on the core of the turbo is a little bit loose from the factory or has run out of tension. Now, BMW has a service bulletin for this, and it's basically just to tighten that hose clamp until there is a very small gap or no gap on that band clamp. So if your turbo is leaking oil, be sure to check out that issue. Now, this will sound awfully familiar to the early N55s I mentioned, but is a very small subset of VINs. There was an issue with the crankshaft bearings on early F30 B58 cars, and there's a very short list of VINs which we'll include a link to. So take a look at the VIN on your car and make sure it isn't on that list. These cars had some bearing failure issues, and the dealerships were basically told, hey, if you see this damage, replace the entire engine. So if you're on that list, you might be able to get a free engine replacement. As I mentioned earlier, this PCV valve has caused a lot of pain, and relatively recently, BMW has extended the warranty for it to 15 years or 150,000 miles. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the cars which have a Gen 1 B58 are actually already approaching or over that mile mark. So if you have that issue and you're under 150,000 miles, make sure to head on down to the dealer and they might be able to give you a free valve cover. We have DIY guides for how to maintain just about every single one of these systems, and we've got most of these parts in stock here at FCP Euro. If you've discovered something about your own B58 that you'd like to share with us that I didn't mention here, please be sure to drop it down in the comments, and if you can, leave us a like and subscribe for future guides and DIYs. I'm Alex Nelson, and we'll see you in the next video.